NATO's Secretary General continues to bow down to the US's interests, calling Trump Daddy Trump. To this day, we see this continued in NATO, this continued catering to the United States and not letting European nations stand for their own interests. Judges, in this debate, we're going to propose that it's now time for European states in NATO to gradually divorce itself from NATO by starting through a gradual military divorce. So before we get into our three substantives, a few notes on framing. First of all, what does this gradual transition that we propose look like? We say that it happens capability by capability. So first, we transition our intelligence gathering away and our cybersecurity capabilities. Then, we start focusing on our, for example, drone warfare, our production of military weapons. And then finally, we fully move the ground troops to the European army. This is a gradual step. We think it will take around 5 years. It's not an overnight thing. It's a gradual thing to ensure that we have a smooth process. Second of all, what does military conflict look like in the modern day world? This is very important to understand because military conflict is not what it was like 20 years ago. It now looks like things like drones, cybersecurity attacks, intelligence gathering. It's a completely different conflict. It's a completely different way where we have military operations, and we believe it's very important to understand this on our side of the house. So we bring to you three main substantives in this speech. First of all, on resolving Europe's sovereignty. Second of all, on how NATO's failures become European failures. And third of all, the risks of continuing to be in NATO, both in terms of foreign policy maneuverability, no thank you, and in terms of Russia. I'll now take the point.
You're talking about sovereignty, but you could still create an independent army of all European states together?
I talk about sovereignty in the way that Europe has the right to stand for its own interests and not for the interests of the United States. I've told you in my book, and I'll continue to tell you my substantive, that NATO and its structure continues to force European states to bend over to this larger superpower, which is the US. What we tell you on our side of the house, that sovereignty for Europe means that they can stand for their own interests, for their own economic interests, for their own foreign policy interests, whether or whether or not they be different than the United States. That's what we mean by sovereignty. So first of all, let's talk about Europe's integration and sovereignty. So we believe that Europe is currently on a path to supranationality. After World War II, we've seen Europe increasingly working together, whether this be diplomatically or economically. At its core, judges, we tell you that Europe is stronger off when it works together. They're stronger off when there's no infighting like there was in the past. They're stronger off when Europe is one cohesive bloc that works together for the better interest of all of this. So why is working as a bloc important? First of all, we tell you it's better for deals and trade because it gives Europe more leverage. They can now negotiate better deals with other foreign actors because they're a bloc that's together and they have large leverage when making these negotiations. Second of all, we tell you on foreign policy leverage. Right now, when Europe is a bloc, in terms of foreign policy, they're a more capable and strong actor. And finally, we tell you about human capital. So when Europe is an integrated bloc, we can move around human capital expertise that, for example, engineering may be stronger in some parts of Europe, research on medicine may be stronger in other parts of Europe. We can have a great human capital integration where you have people and ideas moving around in Europe, and we thus have a greater innovation and greater human capital in Europe. Right? So why is military the natural next step to this, and why does this build more cohesion? Right? So military is the ultimate form of supranationality, where Europe is fully cohesive, right? So now we have countries like Spain and France sharing a military, becoming increasingly more cohesive, right? So let's take Hungary as an example in Europe. They're oftentimes opposed to the European Union, and they're oftentimes sort of have different interests in the European Union. We tell you that if we have military and we have greater cohesion in Europe, nations like Hungary will be better cohesive in Europe. And we tell you that if we have greater cohesion, we have better economical deals, we have more foreign policy leverage, and we have greater human capital integration. So we believe that it's really important that Europe is one cohesive unit, right? So judges, we make a cohesive unit, Europe, and we make a stronger Europe. And now let's talk about sovereignty, which they address in a POI. So the US currently impedes Europe's sovereignty because of the way that NATO structurally caters to the US. The very voting system of NATO sort of gives a lot of power to the US, and we've told you in our hope that the NATO SecGen continues to cater to the US, right? So what this means is that now we see Europe restraining on pursuing their own interests. Let's take Israel-Palestine, right? US is the biggest proponent of the state of Israel. Yet states in NATO are more skeptical about this. Spain recognizes Palestine, and just yesterday, France has decided to take a stand in favor of Palestine. This is something that they would be better capable of doing when they were not part of NATO and when they were sovereign to themselves and to their own interests. Right? Let's also talk about Russia. No, thank you. Let's also talk about Russia and Ukraine. For the US, it's a more distant conflict. For Europe, it's on their western front, right? It's very important for Europe to have a strong Ukraine, to have a weak Russia, and this is not the same interest as the US, right? And also, let's talk about Denmark and Greenland, where the US is directly threatening the sovereignty of another NATO state. We don't believe this is correct, and we've seen the US become increasingly isolationist with this right wing. So even if we see this sort of like flip-flop in US foreign policy, we believe that it's unfair for Europe to depend on their sovereignty on a flip-flopping actor with these flip-flopping foreign initiatives. So why do we tell you on this comparative on why Europe needs its own military? We've told you this principal obligation that Europe has a fundamental right to sovereignty, and we've told you this practical benefits that they get where they finally have the right to their own foreign policy sovereignty. And now, judges, let's talk about NATO's failure. No, thank you. So historically, NATO has been time and time losing legitimacy after the Cold War, and this is solely because of US's offensive policy as trying to be the policing power in the world. We saw this in Iraq. We saw this in Libya. We saw this in Yugoslavia, where the US uses NATO as an offensive tool, and this continues to lose NATO, to diminish NATO's representation, right? Because NATO, at its core, is a defensive organization, and when we see the US encourage NATO to become increasingly offensive, we tarnish their reputation. There are two impacts of this. First of all, we see nations like Russia justifying their military action in Ukraine by saying it's the same thing as what NATO has done in Yugoslavia. It legitimizes this aggression. But second of all, we see Europe's own reputation is diminished. No, thank you. And we'll tell you all about the practical harms of this in our third argument that our second speaker will give. Right? So, and then three structural flaws of like why NATO's failures are failures for the EU. So first of all, let's talk about like this power imbalance where like the very military head of NATO is appointed by the US, right? So this is a structural flaw in NATO, giving the US a lack of sovereignty and not letting Europe fully pursue its own interests. But one of the most important things in this debate is intelligence gathering, right? Where NATO states all share intelligence gatherings, yet we've seen Europe increasingly have its own intelligence operations, doing their own intelligence tests, and NATO's intelligence facilities being based in Estonia, while the US is not part of this NATO initiative because they have their own CIA, right? So now when we see a European military, we'll see a more cohesive intelligence gathering. We'll see that the US no longer has access to Europe's intelligence, and we tell you this is important because of these diverging interests and the US threatening one of NATO's own members, right? So we see this betterment in terms of intelligence gathering. And finally, we tell you this lack of cohesion is really important because we've seen the US tariffing its own allies, threatening the sovereignty of NATO members. We believe this is very important, and these structural flaws of NATO end up being passed down to the EU. So for all these reasons, we're extremely proud to close. Thank you.
Proposition's intent of separating Europe from an alliance not only benefits them, but protects them without any consequence or without any substantial harms that would show why this is such an important measure, shows Team Proposition's recklessness that also showcases itself on its reckless model and its reckless mechanisms onto why this would happen. A few points of setup, then some rebuttal on the things that Team Proposition had said, and lastly, the first two substantives of Team Opposition. Firstly, on some issues, we will address Europeans' withdrawal of NATO with two scenarios. Firstly, a state where some cases, where some states choose to withdraw, which would leave the weak ones alone with the protection of the United States, but still, on the second scenario, that is the most likely one, where all European countries leave, thus dissolving NATO. Instead of a united front, all countries by themselves, by providing the bloc that Team Proposition presented that will revolt now. But second characterization on NATO, which is the most powerful army. It is the only army in the world that is able to match the other very strong army inside the world, that is Russia.
What is information?
No, thank you. Most military and political power comes from the US. That is a point that we are agreeing with the proposition, but this is something that they problematize, actually without mechanizing it as well. But without it, we say that independent European armies are weak. Even a complete put together European army as well will never be able to to match the United States because much of the power that comes from NATO is within the United States, and no matter with the framework of 5 years, they will never be able to match it. So now on the point of rebuttal towards Team Proposition's case, their whole case was hinged on the idea of European sovereignty, which is completely ridiculous since their model is presented on providing a definitely not sovereign, complete European army bloc. Now, if the proposition wants Europe to work as a bloc, then they have to move to an alternate universe where this is actually possible, because in the status quo, not even states alone, countries alone are able to be fully representative of the ideas of the entire population. Take, for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is a state that has 3 presidents, representative of each of the cultural groups that live inside Bosnia and Herzegovina. They have conflicts inside its own population of a state, clashes on sovereignty, and clashes on what the identity of Bosnia truly means. So how does Team Proposition think that they will be able to handle this in a whole European continent? How do they plan cohesion for an entire continent? NATO, by contrast, is based on protection. On the problematization of the United States that they bring, this is completely reinforced. When they say that, for example, the United States is against France is against the United States stance on issues like, for example, Israel and Palestine. Now they try to problematize the United States as they try to demonize their leverage that they have. Still, they fail to engage on how this benefits actually the European community and the European countries that are apart from NATO. They say that France is against the United States on these issues and that they should be independent. But we ask ourselves, why wouldn't this happen in the counterfactual? Inside Europe, there are many states who have, on that very same issue that they bring to this debate, the issue of Israel and Palestine, countries with different stances. How would a military protection bloc represent the ideas and values of all European citizens and all European governments? But even if they don't agree, in the status quo, even if France does not agree with the United States stance and defense towards Israel, the military alliances still protect France, and that is much more valuable than any principle that Team Proposition may try to bring, because the status quo, France is protected by this alliance, whether or not they like it and whether or not they try to problematize it, even though we end up seeing how it is definitely not a problem. There is no sovereignty on their side, no matter what they try to frame to you, pal, because on their model, there is definitely no European sovereignty, just because they are apart and they're separated from the United States, which they don't end up problematizing enough. There is no sovereignty because they are still being all together without the representation of a sovereign state. So, starting with our first argument on military protection against external threats. What we prove here is that the withdrawal of NATO removes a barrier from external actors attacking European states and thus jeopardizing the states and its people. Now, as we told you in our setup, NATO is the biggest army of the world. NATO acts as a bloc. If you attack one country of NATO, it is as if you were attacking all of the countries of NATO. Now, why is this important? This acts as a deterrent from other states attacking, for 3 main reasons. Firstly, because attacking one country becomes far more dangerous if they're belonging to NATO. There are more serious and more bigger risks of retaliation, especially given the consideration that it is the United States that we're talking about that would retaliate. Secondly, it puts a global multilateral superpower against you. Even if states do attack, the retaliation is short and effective, preventing further escalation because it is such a global superpower that and even if this case is rare, the retaliation is very simple and effective. Because actually Panama, who stands a chance with a full-scale war with so many powerful countries and with such a powerful army as NATO? But thirdly, and it is exclusive on our side, we have neutral deterrence from the United States. This makes other countries think, well, this state with this huge powerful state will probably retaliate nuclearly. So it acts as a deterrent for other countries to attack a country that is part of NATO. That only happens on our side. This motion ultimately destroys this effect and makes invasions and attacks much more accessible and affordable by foreign powers. What are the reasons for this? Firstly, because there is no more political leverage. There is no more ability to deter. But secondly, let's talk about the little guy. They're not being protected here on our side because it is much more easy to invade or to be coerced by actions if you do not have the power of the United States backing you. The impact here is a free pathway to take over Europe, killing and destroying many cities, destroying many lives, as we have seen that it has happened in Ukraine. Before moving on to our second substantive, I'll take point.
Yeah, can you characterize Europe's interest in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I mean, there are many interests in Southeast Asia as global superpowers. Southeast Asia is aligned with the other global superpower that represents countries like, for example, Russia and China, but still, being part of NATO is much more than that and about the interest of Europe, but still represents the interest of defense of the European countries that without an army, that they do not have strong enough independent armies for them to actually defend themselves without the interest of the United States, at least under the 5 years that the proposition here is trying to bring. Second argument on potential coordination, the thesis is that separating NATO takes away negotiation capabilities and international legitimacy. In the status quo, the military alliances create economic leverage. For example, the US sanctions against Russia or how they took them out of the Swiss system and making them unable to take credit as a response towards the war. Now, what does Europe need? This, firstly, because on their own they have little to no leverage. Most of NATO's political power relies on the United States. Without it, any European-bound army is bound to be much, much weaker, inevitably, because the United States is so much powerful that the sole European country will ever be, even if they work together. But secondly, there is the need to invest in a new independent army, competing with the army of the United States that they have just separated and expressed how they do not want to be a part of them anymore, which will provoke an offensive response or will create some tensions, but also with Russia that has incentives of colonialism has incentives of invading this country. So what are our impacts? On a weak Europe, there is the less incentive to cooperate and to protect each other, because nobody will want to defend a country without having the army like the US on your side. So on our side, armies develop together to be safe and cooperative. On theirs, it is to destroy and attack. So we are so proud to oppose.
Judges, opposition has rested their entire case on the notion that NATO will follow through, that NATO will do what Europe asks, and that is fundamentally untrue. We've told you since first that NATO is not a reliable actor, that it is a bad actor. They've completely dropped this point. NATO is no longer an institution that Europe should be tethered to, should be a part of. It's harming them in every single way, and for these reasons we are proud to propose. Before getting some rebuttals on engendering clashes on the US versus Europe and their interests and NATO's reliability versus the capability of European armies, I want to get into a couple notions of clarification and ultimately a few drop points that they have. So first of all, clarification. They kind of talked about independent European armies not being as strong. Again, it's the combined European army, not when tethered in NATO, not individual standing armies. Furthermore, we completely dropped an entire point on NATO's history, right? We've told you since first that NATO is no longer a reliable actor. NATO has historically and continually served as a vessel for US interests. We see this in the 2011 invasion of Libya, where NATO acted, and US used NATO's capabilities against the wishes of every single other NATO state that all objected to it. They did not win. They used all of NATO's capabilities to invade Libya. We saw the invasion of Iraq, which has caused devastation in the Middle East. The United States has long used NATO as a vessel for its own political interests, for its own political standings, but we do not stand for that. Europe is not having stake in NATO. No, thank you. We told you since our first that the voting capabilities mean that the United States has a greater share than it should, and ultimately, we do not stand for this. We do not think this serves Europe anymore. Now, to get into this first kind of rebuttal clash on what sovereignty, on the US versus Europe, they talked a lot about sovereignty. This is the main clash of their rebuttals, right? I want to just define what sovereignty looks like. When we're talking about sovereignty, right, we're talking about the ability of a nation to exercise their own right and their own interests. And right now, the US and European interests are diverging. The US is focusing, as we talked about in our POI, on Southeast Asia, on the Middle East. These are not areas of concern for Europe. Europe doesn't care. Europe focuses on Europe, on the Ukraine, the invasion of Russia, which is an existential threat to Europe, and its potential relationships in Africa, which I'm going to do on our third point. But the United States, with these emerging interests in Africa, we're seeing that these interests no longer align. It no longer serves Europe to be part of an organization that fundamentally serves a different actor with different interests and different capabilities. This no longer helps it, right? And we're seeing that the United States is becoming increasingly aggressive and hostile towards Europe. I first told you this. They've threatened to annex countries in Europe, in NATO. They've threatened to withdraw from NATO if Europe doesn't give up, no thank you, a certain amount of their economy for this military idea. And Donald Trump's articulated people refuse to help NATO, to help Europe if Russia continues its invasion. These are not things, NATO is no longer a stable actor, and the United States cannot rely on NATO for these things. Their entire case hinges upon the fact that if something happens, if something were to happen with Russia, NATO would intervene. And we do not see that as the case, right? The United States is incredibly unstable, it's self-serving, it's isolationist, it's protectionist. We've told you this up and down our bench, this will not exist. Furthermore, I want to talk about this idea of Europe, right? They talked a lot about Europe not being cohesive. We believe Europe is cohesive, right? We have the EU. We have these coalitions of states that help economically and socially. We have these joint and cultural cultural, socioeconomic, these ties to each other, these alliances that stem from being natural allies, that stem from shared backgrounds, shared histories. We don't see this with the US. And what we see with this, no thank you, is the notion that Europe is completely unstable and fragile is completely false. We provided no mechanization on this claim. Now, to get into our second clash on NATO's reliability and the capabilities of European armies. We talked about this earlier, but the United States has not guaranteed that it will help NATO, and quite frankly, even if it said it did, Europe should not have to rely on a different army of a different country to protect its own sovereignty. If Russian invasion or Russian aggression were to continue, Europe should not have to rely on the US, who has threatened it. And even if it didn't, it shouldn't have to rely on any other country. It should take these steps because right now, its entire army relies on the United States. Furthermore, they talk about this idea of European armies' capabilities if this were to occur, right? France and the United Kingdom have nuclear weapons. They are part of Europe. This is not a claim that's only on their side of the house. And furthermore, as our first speaker characterized to you, we see that warfare relies a lot on cybersecurity, relies a lot on these cyber attacks, these cyber intelligence mechanisms. What's happening right now, as our first speaker told you, is that the United States has the CIA, and they're refusing to share information from the CIA to other countries in NATO. I mean, this is a factual statement. And what we're seeing within that is we're seeing that Europe itself is trying to create these defense initiatives for cybersecurity because it is so important. We've seen this in the Russian-Ukraine war, we've seen this in Israel-Palestine. These are the methods of warfare of the current day. But what the United States is doing is they're refusing to allow European countries to spend their capabilities on cybersecurity because they have their own. And they're weaponizing the information that Europe has against Europe itself. This is not a stable actor who sits up and down our bench. This is not something that Europe needs to rely on. And we believe that if Europe was able to come together, to have more of a mechanism for its ability to create a standing army, to transition its cybersecurity capabilities, etc., we'd be better off in the long term and the short term. Now to the POI.
Yeah, I think you're demonizing much the fact that the United States is a member of NATO because given that they are protecting all these armies that without the United States interest, they would be much, much weaker and would not be able to just sustain themselves from an invasion.
We can see that the United States has an army, right? They are a strong country. No one's disagreeing with this point. What we're saying, what we've told you up and down our bench, I cannot be more clear. Europe fundamentally, principally, should not have to rely on an army from the United States to protect itself. And even if that wasn't true, even if we can see that all these points on how the US is reliable, they shouldn't have to rely on another country that has different interests and different policies. This doesn't make sense. And we believe that Europe needs to separate itself because it's interfering, which I'll talk about in my third point, interfering with its own capabilities. And ultimately, we see that the United States has factually threatened NATO. They've threatened withdrawal, they've threatened annexation. This is no longer a stable actor. We're not demonizing it, we're telling the truth. Now, here's our third point, on the risks of staying in NATO. So we see insane practical costs for Europe to continue staying in NATO. First of all, we see an inability for Europe to pursue its trade interests and access alliances. Europe is a natural ally to Africa, right? This is incredibly important. And Europe has, not only are they geographically close, but Europe has a principal responsibility to aid in the development and prosperity of these nations, stemming from colonial times and its colonization, right? And not only does it begin to undo the harms previously incurred, but it also creates a larger ability for trade and economic relationships for both Europe and Africa. I think this is incredibly important. NATO's interests do not lie in Africa. As we told in the POI, they lie in Southeast Asia, they lie in the Middle East. And what's going on right now, as we told you in our second point, is NATO's reputation is increasingly tarnished beyond repair. I mean, we see this in the NATO nation of Libya. And because Europe is so associated with NATO, because they're so associated with a decreasing, with a falling United States, they're tethering themselves onto a power who is unstable, who's perceived negatively by Europe, and by these developing nations, where Europe could actually create genuine benefits, mutual symbiotic benefits. And instead of establishing these mutually beneficial alliances, NATO has tainted Europe and driven Africa towards China. Panel, we think these relations with China are kind of problematic. They're often full of debt traps, exploitation, and draining resources out of Africa. So this leads to a continued lack of independence for Africa and an inability to develop, which obviously has trickle-down effects to citizens, right? We see worse quality of life, we see worse development. And the reason why I want to focus on this is Europe's decision to stay in NATO or leave NATO does not just fall on Europe. It has consequences on the entire world, including Africa, and Europe's representation in NATO is prohibiting it from accessing these relationships. Africa's choice shouldn't be between China and a NATO-based Europe. And Europe separating itself from NATO acts as a signaling mechanism away from the US's imperialist aggression and a hegemonic world, right? We go much more closer to these relationships and it widens Europe's foreign policy maneuverability. So we see more optionality and better relationships for African nations. We see increased development, more stable and symbiotic relationships, both economic and socially, and we see trickle-down effects to the ultimate lives of citizens in Africa and Europe. And furthermore, just very quickly, let's look at the potential risks of staying in NATO. We've characterized you since first that NATO no longer serves the interests of Europe. And if Russian aggression were to continue, we have no guarantee no guarantee that NATO would be there, that NATO would be there as much as it needs to be, that the US would not withdraw from NATO and leave them by themselves. They've worked with Russia before, they worked with Russia again, they clearly have no problem with aggression. This would have devastating effects on Europe. We are so proud to oppose. Thank you.
So because the propositions proposed for deliberately increases both instability and tensions in an already prone to conflict world, they are the least attractive side to choose in this debate. So remember the 3 P's we care about. First of all, we care about peace, we care about protection, and we care about power of the states of Europe and the entire world, and I'll prove how we get each of those 3 points. So I will first present the 3 main points of reputation on their side, and then I will present our third argument on the proliferation of conflict, okay? So let's start with reputations. So they talked about continuously about US influence and how European countries need their sovereignty, and that NATO's president is chosen by the US, so they need to detach themselves from that. First of all, it's not on the interest whatsoever to separate for Europe to separate itself from the US. The US provides a literal umbrella to protect Europe from other powers like Russia. Russia knows that it can't go up against the US, so it won't act against Europe, who will NATO protect them. And second point of all, the European military sovereignty is not at risk in NATO. In fact, it is incentivized by the US president, by the whole organization in itself. They literally have a budget, they have a limit that they have to increase their army from a certain amount of budget. So they have to surpass this limit and increase their power, their military power, based on that. So military sovereignty is actually incentivized in NATO. And they also complain about like Daddy Trump, but now this problem will actually be worse because they will have to worry about Daddy Putin right now. And Daddy Trump won't blow them up if they're still in NATO. But even if this was true and they care about US influence, the US will surely retaliate against Europe if they purposely leave NATO, signaling their alliance is over, which I will continue to develop in more detail in a third argument. But they also talked about these conflicting interests. So they said that Europe's interests are currently conflicted with the US because US is more focused on the Eastern Europe and Asia. So Europe's interest of being protected by the more dangerous powers like Russia definitely outweigh the different focuses the nations may have with the US on a first note. But second of all, they never mechanize why the different interests actually really impacts Europe and the power they hold on the international community and the power they have to defend themselves in the international conflict in case it happens. So now on a second point, they told you that the NATO will tarnish their reputation and that Europe's power is diminished currently because NATO is losing its power and reputation in the international community. So I will actually flip this argument and tell you why European countries lose all of their political leverage and power on their side of the house solely. In negotiations without NATO, because we agree that if European countries literally leave NATO, NATO no longer exists. In negotiations, they no longer have the precedence and the prestige of NATO alliance. And sure, they claim it's losing its reputation and this would happen eventually, but who do we think will emit more power, competence, or prestige to the international community? A newly created organization that is more vulnerable to Russian attacks, or NATO, a decades-old alliance that has actually funded Ukraine in a war, actually protecting one of its allies, actually has done something to the international community and is backed by the powerful US. So on their side, actually, Europe loses all of the power in negotiations in terms of diplomacy, retaliation, and accountability against countries who exceed their power. So NATO currently has this power and will lose it completely to hold other nations accountable on their side of the house. And lastly, they claim that the US is becoming an unstable actor, so we should definitely move away from this. So we've actually already told you, reviewed this on several points. First of all, that the US actually promotes European army to grow. So they've even recently set a higher minimum of money each country has to spend on their army. Other countries have actually followed this. So if the US wanted to attack Europe, would they really do this? Would they incentivize their opponents to improve their military power even more? So even if this was true, and we take another best case scenario, and the US was dangerous, it still doesn't outweigh the possible dangers that NATO faces and Europe faces on its own without the US protecting them, and they haven't really retaliated us on this, on the fact that we've seen Russia and other powers attack Europe currently, and they incentivize this danger on their side of the house more, so we win on this point completely. So before moving on with our third and last argument, yes, I'll take you.
If Russia is so terrified of the United States military power, why would it explicitly state that the invasion of Ukraine was because of NATO and it would would not stop invading and using military power until NATO is disabled. So of course Russia is trying to blame NATO for of course they will do so, because they are trying the US not to retaliate on Russia. Of course they will blame the organization that actually has the organization that has most funded Ukraine on these conflicts. So it's definitely in the interest of Russia to actually blame NATO, but the facts prove otherwise, that NATO has been the sole defendant of Ukraine in this conflict. So moving on with our last argument, I will prove how US retaliation will be actually worse on their side, because the US will actually now have a bigger interest to attack Europe. So it was leaving the fact that European countries leave NATO will send a message to the US that the whole Europe is now against it. In NATO, the US works to protect the rest of Europe, while US ensures that Europe won't retaliate against it. That's how alliances work, and that's what will be broken. If you now take that away, everyone is suddenly leaving the US alone. So let's say, for example, we're in a friend group, okay, and everyone leaves the sole actor alone. So they now don't have the friend group, and this will send the message that his other friends don't like the US anymore. They don't want to hang anymore with them. So the same reasoning of escalation of conflict now applies here as well. If other countries that are no longer in alliance start to improve their army and start to independently foster this conflict, it will create an arms race between Europe and the US, where each country purposely incentivizes the more militarization, because they fear the other actor is going to do it as well. So this creates more tension, more probability of conflicts, because if tensions arise and countries suddenly have more power on their hands, they will surely find a reason to act upon it and use the military power they now hold so desperately. So every minor trigger, every minor sneeze will cause this conflict to escalate. So the US will be taking more measures to protect itself from future attacks. You see how now everyone is directly against each other, while we currently have a world where we have this peace, so why break that stability? So on impacts, we get first on stability. So when conflicts arises inevitably, because tensions will eventually lead to this conflict where everyone is suddenly improving their militarization, like in an arms race would. The economy stagnates, especially if European countries are involved. It will affect the European economy, as seen in Russia-Ukraine war, where Europe saw a lack of gas and oil because Russia couldn't produce anymore, which is one of the most prominent providers of gas and oil. So because they get more spending on high consistent military, which is not prevented now, but forced one, because we are actually in a conflict that will cause for no reason whatsoever, apart from the fact that NATO is losing prestige. We get no innovation, we get no investment on their side of the house, because countries, when they see this lack of stability and uncertainty, they won't actually have the incentives to trade with Europe, because they're in the middle of a war with the most powerful country, the US. So for all of these reasons, because we've proven that we'll get more peace, because we prevent a conflict from even happening between the two most powerful sectors of our world, because we help Europe stay away from the power of Russia, and because we've proven that we get more economic stability on our side of the house, we win this debate. Thank you.
Judges, I want you to think of Yugoslavia. A lot of us were there last year in Serbia, and what did we see? We saw the signs of resentment against NATO. 20 years ago, we saw NATO bombing Yugoslavia. Now, we can debate the merits of this on whether it fit into the role of a police state or not, but the reality is civilians died at the hand of this organization, and the reality is that that instance continues to affect Europe and the US today, where we have a NATO that is tainted as a result. As a consequence, we have a Serbia that is looking outwards. A Serbia that, despite being in Europe, is looking to partners like Russia and China instead of working with its natural regional partners in Europe. We have a Serbia that is doing all this because of the US, because the US has been taken from their eyes, because they cannot afford to work with an actor that has delegitimized itself in its way. On our side, we give these states the abilities to work independently together as a region, and we give them a better shot with Europe and without the US. Proud to propose two clashes we see in this debate. Firstly, on Europe's needs and whether NATO can meet these, especially in terms of military matters, and second, on sovereignty and collaboration in Europe. Let's get right into the first clash on Europe's needs and whether NATO can actually address this. So I'll rest a large portion of the case on Europe on Europe's broad military concerns and NATO being essential to providing these. So what are some of the things they tell us? They tell us they need things like nuclear deterrence. They tell us they need things like protection versus Russia. And they tell us that Europe needs to be alongside the US for this age of great power competition. First off, we believe that Europe already broadly meets these military objectives. I mean, to just say that they need US for deterrence is absurd, okay? The UK and France are literally nuclear powers. We don't buy this umbrella is completely gonna fade when Europe acts alone. Just don't let them influence you in that way. Second of all, with Russia, we already are seeing this today. Russia cannot even get beyond Ukraine. Okay? Russia is a menacing power, but Europe can likely effectively stand against it alone. And in fact, we see the US actually hampering Europe's ability to stand against Russia, in particular with things like sanctions, where they told them to be cautionary, to not go all the way, whereas European powers have wanted to put more sanctions on oil, and we see the US actually hampering this. So if we're concerned about Russia, we actually activate this when Europe can act independently. But we also tell you that NATO, again, actively hampers these military objectives. And let me give you two key reasons as to why. First is a lack of focus. We exposed this to you in our PY, where we asked them, why is NATO interested in Southeast Asia? To which they had no response. The reality is, Europe is not interested in Southeast Asia, okay? I don't think Spain, my country, should be actively concerned about Vietnam's waters, and I think it should be more concerned about what's happening on its fronts as a region and its regional strength. So we see a lack of focus when they're engaged in NATO, that they have to be a proxy to all that the US wants to achieve in the world, which is not necessarily, and is not what Europe wants to achieve as its own independent power. And then the second key reason is this unstable dependence on the US, especially Trump. Again, they fixated, we told you this in second and first, that they fixated a large portion of their case on NATO actually delivering what they say they're going to deliver. This is not the reality. Trump has literally told so-called NATO partners that we are going to not protect you if Russia invades. He has literally told them, you cannot rely on us. This is just not a stable partnership. So insofar as we have this US dependence, here's where we actually get a concern on their side. Because if a problem does arise with Russia, we see that in ops world, the military structure of Europe is literally folded into the American military structure. So their ability to work together to actually confront this threat is significantly diminished. This is key, and this should be the number one concern of yours because we are really talking about Europe's fate when it comes to a war that all of us are anticipating. We're talking about the destruction of European citizens. We're talking about the loss of lives in Europe. And the reality is that the US is likely not going to follow through. And when Europe's military structure is dependent on the US following through, it's increasingly unstable. And even if you don't buy that, on our side of the house, we get this independent maneuverability. We get the preventative things against Russia. We get limiting Russia's strengths on this front because we get all these things that the US is currently unwilling to do in stopping this hostile act. And again, this legitimacy that Russia has in going into Ukraine, we don't really buy it, but Russia is able, we gave this to you really clearly at first, is able to actually pursue these aggressive patterns under the guise of saying they're opposing NATO aggression. So if Europe wants to be an effective independent actor, it needs to divorce itself from this group, these awful aspects of NATO's history, so it can effectively, rhetorically oppose these acts of aggression, to get these citizens in Russia to be less supportive of these acts of aggression. And when they're tied with the US, we're going to see that this ability to deliver on those fronts does not exist. So in the event of Russian aggression, there is significantly higher loss of life. This is key. This is the biggest impact you should take away. They get worse of this. We do much better on this front. This should completely win the debate for us. But if not, let's get into the second clash on sovereignty and collaboration. But first, I'll take the board.
So, if the European countries are so mad at the US, why do they accept all these impositions that the US has, like increasing budgets? Because the threat is to leave NATO.
Look, we told you that Europe has this power on their own. The reality is right now they're stuck in this mentality where they need complete dependence on the US. We told you they can stand alone, but the reality is when they have this dependence on the US, it actually leads to these structural failings, right? We told you that countries like Hungary, and we're going to get into this in the clash, are able to run amok, are able to do what they want, because at the end of the day, they have this security dependence. It's only by isolating Europe, by making it an independent actor, that we can activate these aspects of its power. And let's talk about that right now. So they actually tell us this. Right now in this PY, but they make a big deal out of European fracturing. And they tell us Bosnia and Herzegovina, they don't really develop this, but we'd be fine to develop this, as we just told you, countries like Hungary, but also countries like Turkey, who oppose European actions, who oppose European goals. And the reality of why they do this is because of the US dependence. At the end of the day, they can risk alienating fellow European countries, their natural regional allies, because at the end of the day, they have that US support coming in. When we, in our world, put Europe together, we force this collaboration because Hungary now has to depend on these European powers. Now Hungary has to integrate its military with these other European powers, and now Hungary needs to have their support, needs to be working towards them, and we get this collaboration. And this is essential because of all that we told you in our first speech, which went unresponded to, about the benefits of this cohesion. We told you things like human capital. We told you things like competition. We told you all the advantages of when European countries work together, how it improves the lives of their citizenry. They unaddress this, and this is critical. They left this out because they cannot have a world in theirs where they get similar levels of EU integration, of EU collaboration. Like even countries like my country, Spain, can get away with not investing heavily in their militaries because of the US support. So if we want to talk about activating European countries as military powers, it ends when we get rid of like this massive automatic US backing, which we don't buy, which is a mirage, and we force these countries to put the dependence on themselves, to put the burden on themselves. So we strengthen cohesion, and this is important again because of all the impacts we told you about strengthening cohesion. But then let's also talk about increasing European leverage. And here's where we can bring you back to Yugoslavia and the tainted image of NATO. And this is also key. It's key because it's critical on our side because we told you Europe can act independently and act in a way where its reputation is not being compromised because of the US. And we gave you several clear impacts of this, especially on developing states, where we've made a key stakeholder in this debate and where we've seen no engagement from opposition because they can't do anything for them. We told you, right, that these countries in developing states are faced with a choice between like US and Europe and China. And right now, they're leaning towards China. Why? Because it's state image. Because neighbors of Libya saw what happened in 2011, where NATO went in and brutally removed a power like against international law. So what does that mean? They're turning to China, and this is bad because we've seen China act as an unstable partner. For example, like the debt deals, the debt traps they've had with like Sri Lanka and things. So what do we do when we activate Europe? We put Europe as an independent actor that can provide a third way to these countries. Not just that, but we give Europe a chance to correct its colonial harms. They have harmed these countries in the past, and only by activating Europe's independence can it act on the front to help these countries to fix its past mistakes. And this can, again, only occur when Europe is an independent actor. And finally, again, consider as an independent actor the principle of sovereignty. It is not right for Europe to depend on the US. It is not right for them to cater to Donald Trump. It is not right for people to hold this power that literally threatens themselves, that threatens the annexation agreement. So for these reasons, because we provide a mechanism for how European countries can act independently, and because we provide a mechanism for how this independence benefits their own security and benefits third world countries and developing states, we win this debate.
Opposition based their case, a proposition based their case on the demonization of NATO, an organization that A, has carried on sanctions towards Russia, has been able to coordinate both economic and diplomatic sanctions towards Russia, that is the most threatening actor to Europe in the status quo. That B is an organization in which Europe is relying to protect from Russia, actually, because that's where most of the budget comes, that's where most of the military comes in order to generate this cooperative progression. But C, that is an organization in which European countries are seeking to maintain, in which they allow themselves to be through the impositions from the US to keep this alliance working, in which they want to stay, they show no real reason to dissolve. Two main clashes on this debate. Firstly, on the unity of Europe, and second, on the legitimacy of both organizations. So Prop tells you that they want sovereignty from Europe, that they want to follow the interests of Europe. From the beginning, I want to outframe this point by telling you that second concedes how NATO needs the US, when they tell you that NATO is allowing the US to impose all these things and to impose increasing budgets, for example, because they need all this nuclear and military arsenal, which is the only one of these alliances that can really match Russia. However, we are continue to engage. So they tell you that they want to give leverage to Europe, right? That they want to give it all freedom and collaboration. This responds to this idea. Firstly, we told you that they have the European Union. They have an economic bloc in which European countries actually commerce and do rely economically on each other. Therefore, they can carry out all these benefits that they have. This European Union is so strong that it's able to fight tariffs coming from the US that the proposition is proposing as a moral. As a human. Remember, panel, how European Union uses sanctions on food and different things to actually be able to negotiate these tariffs and to reduce them on the status quo. So we tell you that this unity in Europe, this economic Europe, this Europe that is united, that collaborates, actually exists. Furthermore, we tell you that in Europe we do have countries with conflicting opinions that do engage in the status quo. We see, for example, countries like Germany that are supporting the Palestinian struggle, but other countries are supporting the Israeli army under the influence the Israeli army. Also, panel, notice how they themselves have mentioned countries that don't want to be in this European Union. The UK withdraw from the European Union. Hungary doesn't want to go to the European Union. Serbia doesn't want to go to the European Union. This shows that Europe is a continent that it's not as united as proposition want to make you believe. That there are countries that not only oppose NATO, but oppose the unity, the economic unity of Europe as a whole, where the US has nothing to do. Therefore, we were able to prove that Europe doesn't have this unity or this uniformity sense that proposition wants to give. But secondly, we tell you that the US is actually pushing coordinators between countries. How, panel? Our propositions talk about how they get military development. However, in the status quo, it is the US that is pushing European countries to increase the budget. It is the US that pushed European countries to impose sanctions on Russia and to collaborate with Ukraine, which shows that the US has actually, as an actor, a leading member on increasing the military presence of Europe. However, even if we take that Europe is submitted under our status quo, in the comparative, they actually need the US. Why? To take out Russia. That was our main point. Proposition tried to tell you that countries like the UK can match its military arsenal. But notice, panel, how while Russia has up to 2,000 nuclear bombs, Europe doesn't come no even to 200 or close. The US is the only actor that actually match this nuclear arsenal. But furthermore, the US as a whole invests more than the 10 other countries of NATO that invest the most. Why does this show? That the real power of NATO, that the real military power of NATO is in the US. That is clear on the status quo. Furthermore, on our first speech, we say that the US gives economic tools to the NATO panel. This was not engaged by the proposition. The US gives massive economic capabilities. It has freed accounts of Russia because it is the financial sector of the world. It took Russia out of the SWIFT system, and it has a $1 trillion economic across the one with bigger sanctions toward Russia. Therefore, they give actually much more power to NATO to fight against Russia with all its economic tools. Why do we win this clash? First, mainly because we were able to address status quo. A status quo in Europe needs the US to fight Russia. Even if we concede the interest in the Middle East, their interest on Africa, first, US will still intervene in Africa, and secondly, the biggest threat is Russia. So before going with our second clash, I'll tell you why.
Yeah, the US has drawn up battle plans for annexing Greenland. Why should Denmark and Europe have confidence in a power that threatens their territorial sovereignty?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
The US has drawn up battle plans for annexing Greenland. Why should Denmark and Europe have confidence in a power that threatens their territorial sovereignty?
I believe that the biggest threat at this moment, firstly, is Russia, but secondly, this is a specific country in the sense that even if the US has threatened Denmark without actually doing something about it, the biggest threat on the status quo, again, is Russia that has much more access to Europe than the US has. This is about the whole Europe, not individual actions. Second question, on the legitimacy of both organizations. So first, Rob tried to tell you that NATO is illegitimate actor that has even able Russia to justify these wars. We believe that this is not important for the debate. Firstly, because the justification of a war is not that relevant. It's not like Russia would have invaded Ukraine without this justification. But secondly, they also give an incentive. Why? Because they are also creating a military alliance on Europe that also is seeking to fight Russia. Therefore, both sides have that incentive on Russia. But secondly, they forget that what gives real legitimacy to a military organization, it is military power. This is very intuitive panel. The second proposition forgets how US is a massive world power. US has the biggest army in the world. US spends much more than almost all the rest of Europe, of NATO countries combined. Therefore, it is the actor that gives actual leverage and gives actual presence to NATO. However, they also want to solve this problem of legitimacy by creating a completely new organization panel. An organization that has lost most of its army, that has lost most of its international economic leverage, and an organization that doesn't have any real global hegemony in it. Therefore, has much less power than the original, or legitimacy than the original NATO. Well, furthermore, we feel that on our second argument, we feel that the US will probably retaliate against this new union. Why? Because it is a direct attack to it. And furthermore, we feel that China, the other global behemoth, is actually supporting Russia that's attacking the US. Therefore, on their side, their new organization was actually against the interests of main global powers. Why is this key, panel? Why is this key? Because even if we give this sovereignty principle, the fact that they lose any possible negotiation power, that they lose military power, is much worse than considering sovereignty. Why do we win this clash? Firstly, because we prove that proposition it will be very, very hard to create a new organization with actual legitimacy. Firstly, without a real global power with behemoth, someone that can feel the US stance, someone that can feel the space that the gap that the US has left on their side of the house. But secondly, that they're to create a forceful unity in Europe. And Europe that firstly, in which Germany and the UK also participated in the Balkan Wars and are also represented by Balkan countries, an organization and a continent in which the UK literally led the European Union, and a continent in which countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, Italy are opposing the rest of Europe in terms of immigration crisis and having their own policies that go completely against Europe. And finally, a continent that is deeply ethnically separated, in which countries between the Balkans that even if outside of NATO countries like Syria, Croatia, Bosnia also hate themselves. So because proposition wants to create unity where there is no unity, we couldn't power to oppose. Thank you.
The proposition is defending a world where daddy-less Europe, unexperienced children playing around, left home because daddy was too strict. The children are now far more vulnerable to thieves and to kidnappers, and surely a power conflict will surge. Someone has to become the man of the helm. Now, 3 questions that summarize this debate. First question, does the counterfactual protect Europe? The answer to this question, panel, is no. Safety here, which is a crucial metric for this debate, has been completely abandoned by the team of proposition, which is shown in their points of test that they didn't even mention it. They say that Europe should not have to rely on external actors, but they never explain how it still does on their side. Even when they divorce from NATO, as they say, there is still leverage over external actors on their side. They want for you to believe that their independent army will be powerful enough to outweigh the federal status quo and all the harms that this brings. But they tell you that it is a smooth transition that will be carried out in 5 years and it's going to be very, very peaceful. Here's what they do not tell you. That the new European army will never be as strong as the army of the United States that will respond towards this divorce that they are planning, which ultimately falls under proposition's characterization of the US as some evil villain that wants the worst, the best for them, and the worst for Europe and all the other actors. But also we will never be as strong as other armies, other very strong armies, such as Russia, which have the intentions of invading and taking over Europe and have expressed so for many years. Europe will never stand a chance if they are not with their so-called daddy. Even if they win on principle in this debate, which they ultimately don't, the real-life consequences harm Europe and its citizens. So they have the burden of proving that Europe will be better, and they ultimately fail to prove it. Second question, will this motion reclaim European sovereignty and reflect its interests? The answer again is no. Team opposition's most lacking point, and ironically, their most strong emphasis that they made throughout this debate was on European sovereignty and how they reclaim this throughout this motion. Now they try to scare you away from it. They try to scare you by telling you that European states being a part of NATO takes away their sovereignty and that they're going to reclaim it. And they tell you this motion brings sovereignty back. Now, what does this sovereignty look like? And that is something that we tried that we successfully explained throughout this debate. It looks like a new collective bloc that they say will reflect everybody's interest, as if that was actually possible. We explained how just because they're in the same continent, they do not have the same interest. We brought many examples, such as, for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which within a same state, people do not have the same interest. We also challenged and flipped the example that they brought on Israel and Palestine by saying that many countries in Europe have different stances on the issue, so a collective bloc will never reflect the interest of all. What will really happen is there will be a void that a void of mediation that the US previously filled on their side. So either that void will be filled by another country, which ultimately counteracts all the things that they are standing for the European Union being completely independent and sovereign, as they say. All the Europeans will never reach a consensus, which will lead to a complete chaos that will ultimately destroy Europe and make them even more vulnerable than what they would be. So, third question and last. Is the United States harming the interest of NATO European members? The answer, once again, is no. They tell you that, guys, the United States is evil, we should run away from them because they hide information through the CIA and because they fund Israel when France is in favor of Palestine. Now, here's what they don't tell you. The United States protects Europe, and that is crucial for them. Even beyond, and even if all the points that they make standing in this debate, and they're much less important than the impacts on their real life, on the fact that Europe is protected right now, and they would never be protected if we were to impose this motion. That is much more important than any principle. They bring out Africa and Southeast Asia by saying that Europeans do not care about them, and we agree. Europeans care about themselves. They care about their own security. need for the United States protection, so they need to be a part of NATO. So proud to oppose.
Three things I'm going to do in this speech. First of all, I'm going to tell you which side better serves the interests of the EU. Second of all, I'm going to tell you what's best for the world as a whole. Third of all, I'm going to do some weighing. So first of all, on what's best for Europe's interests. So I'm going to give one observation that I've seen throughout this debate, is that side opposition has a very poor picture of what geopolitical dynamics look like. So let me tell you what we tell you. We tell you that the interests of the EU and the US are rapidly diverging, something that they don't fully push back on their side of the house. And we tell you that the US actively impedes NATO's strength in cybersecurity and in intelligence gathering. What they tell you is that NATO's own interests don't really matter, but most importantly, they ignore the US telling NATO that they won't protect them, and they ignore the sort of hostility inside NATO. Judges, we really win this clash because we tell you first on this principle of European sovereignty, right? We've told you since first, in our second speech, in our third speech, up and down our bench, repeatedly, that Europe has a right to sovereignty, a right to stand for its own interests, a principal right that we believe is independent from all other things, and that alone should necessitate you panel to give your ballot to side opposition. But independent of that, even if you don't buy this principle, we give you this practical on intelligence. We give you this practical on how NATO and the US's continued involvement in NATO impedes Europe from protecting its own interests. And we tell you this European cohesion as something core in this debate and something core that wins us this debate. Right? But let me tell you this other major question. What is best for the world as a whole? Judges, side opposition completely drops this argument because they know it costs them the debate. We've told you up and down our bench that Africa is a key stakeholder. The developing states are a key stakeholder, and NATO's poor reputation actively impedes Europe from engaging with these states. We've told you that Europe has a principal obligation to correct its arms from neocolonialism, and we tell you that this alone is very important in this debate because it's mutually exclusive on our side of the house. NATO's poor reputation impedes Europe from being involved in Africa. Europe should be involved in Africa. Europe has an obligation, a principal obligation, to help with the development of Africa. This alone, another independent path to the ballot that we've told you. We've told you that what matters for the rest of the world independently wins us the debate. And the reason why opposition has not engaged in this, and the reason why we've not had more debate on this, is because opposition knows that if they respond to this, they're losing, and this alone loses them the debate. And finally, I'm going to get on to some weighing and tell you why opposition's main pushback does not win them the debate, and why these two questions are what really matters. Right? So what they tell you is that NATO is good, the sort of economic and military power against Russia is really bad. Judges, at best this is symmetrical, because what we tell you, most importantly, is that Europe does not need as much military power. We tell you that NATO, because of the US, has these interests in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, right? Something that Europe does not care about. All that Europe cares about is Russia. So even if the European army has less military strength on its own, we tell you that they don't need this full military strength that comes with the US, right? Because they have less interest, they only care about Russia. So this is symmetrical, right? But we also tell you in our second, and this is very important, that Europe has military power itself, right? So if Europe divorces itself from NATO, they will still be able to deal with their main adversary as Russia. So this is the main push that we see from the opposition bench. In terms of that NATO is good. But we tell you, judges, that we protect best the interests of NATO. We tell you on this principle ground alone, we win this debate. But we also give you the practical on how the US's continued involvement in NATO actively hurts European states. But we also tell you that we are the side that best stands for the rest of the world. For the world as a global state, for the African developed states, and for Europe's principal obligation to help African states after colonizing them. So for all those reasons, judges, vote properly.